The evidence is stacked against him, but Boris Johnson fought for his political life today over Partygate. Threatened with being the first Prime Minister in British history to be kicked out of Parliament, Johnson defended himself in a parliamentary session that got increasingly fractious.
People who say that we were partying in lockdown simply do not know what they are talking about. This is complete nonsense. I mean, complete nonsense. I asked the relevant people.
But a whistleblower who was inside number 10 at the time tells us his story still does not add up.
It's really questionable because what I saw compared to what he said he saw, they're two different things.
Whilst Boris Johnson awaits the judgment of his peers, our team, who've led this story from the beginning, give us their verdict. Also in News at 10 tonight. A good day to publish your tax returns after months of avoiding requests. Why did Rishi Sunak wait until this afternoon to show us the money? Romilly takes us through what we've learned. Meanwhile, more bad news for those struggling with their bills. Another spike in inflation driven by food costs. Joel tells us why we should expect interest rate rises in response. Prince William makes a surprise visit to troops in Poland, just an hour from the Ukrainian border, and
The baby in 5 minutes.
And it's free?
Yep, free, completely free. Not even allowed to accept tips.
BAFTA nominations for a former doctor and frontline police officer who translated their real-life experiences onto the small screen.
This is ITV News at 10 with Raghi Omar.
Good evening. For nearly 3.5 hours today, Boris Johnson faced a grilling from a committee of MPs to try to save his reputation and perhaps his entire political career over the Partygate scandal. Tonight, with the issue of whether he lied to Parliament still hanging in the balance, the question marks over his future remain to be resolved. The former Prime Minister began in bullish style, insisting, hand on heart, he did not knowingly mislead Parliament over gatherings at Downing Street during COVID lockdown. Mr. Johnson said he had believed the gatherings under scrutiny were essential work events within the government's rules and guidelines. But as the questioning continued, tempers began to fray, with Mr. Johnson at one point accusing the inquiry of being manifestly unfair.
Why did you lie to Parliament?
Or did he lie? That was the question facing Boris Johnson today as he headed towards Parliament for a 3-hour-long grilling by MPs. A grilling that began with an oath.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give for this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Addressing MPs who are investigating whether he misled Parliament when he said there were no parties and that guidance had always been followed, Mr. Johnson said,
I'm here to say to you, hand on heart, that I did not lie to the House.
He urged the 7 members of Parliament's Privileges Committee not to trust his former chief aide, Dominic Cummings.
He has every motive to lie.
And then turned to the first part of his defence, focusing on the layout of number 10 Downing Street.
It's a cramped, narrow 18th century townhouse. I had to call many meetings on the spot and to call make a great many high-speed decisions.
But was he really making high-speed decisions in this first image pulled up by the committee? Was this leaving drink for then Director of Communications Lee Kane really necessary?
It was necessary to steady the ship. It was necessary to show that there was no rancour, that the business of the government was being carried on.
Mr. Johnson argued that social distancing was maintained to the best of their ability.
You can't expect human beings in an environment like number 10 to have, as it were, a invisible electrified fence around them. They will occasionally drift into each other's orbit.
And there was this repeated gripe.
People who say that we were partying in lockdown simply do not know what they are talking about.
A group representing COVID-19 bereaved families called the comments a new low for Boris Johnson, and there was scepticism from the committee too.
But I don't think we agree with your interpretation of the guidance.
There's a gathering taking place with between 25 and 40 people. You had clear direct line of sight.
Why didn't you correct the record then? Because that would have been an obvious thing to do.
She was not asking whether you organised the trestle tables with the alcohol on it. She was asking whether you saw the trestle tables with the alcohol
I did see. I don't remember what exactly was on the trestle tables. I know that people around the country will look at those events and think they look like the very kind of events that we, or I, were forbidding to everyone else. But I will believe till the day I die that it was my job to thank staff for what they had done.
So what about an event that got him a police fine? Mr Johnson sounded exasperated as he insisted the birthday gathering involved no singing and said the infamous cake stayed in the box.
Would it not have been obvious to you that the event was in breach of the guidance?
No, and it's a measure of how unobvious it was to me that this was any kind of breach at all, that we actually, or the press office, actually publicised this meeting in the Times newspaper, briefed it out, as I said earlier on, with a slightly embellished account.
Mr Johnson, who occasionally consulted the lawyers flanking him, had another defence, that he had been assured the gatherings had not broken the rules.
Who were the officials who gave these assurances?
Well, I can't name these
Name
officials.
me one.
I don't know if I can.
And then, following another question from another Conservative MP, his anger started to grow.
Perhaps
And I put it to you, Mr Johnson, you did not take proper advice.
I did say, this is complete nonsense. I mean, complete nonsense. I asked the relevant people. They were senior people. They'd been working very hard.
And back he came to that key defence, that to him, the Downing Street gatherings were not parties. But they did force Boris Johnson out of this building. What will they now mean for the rest of his political career? Anushka Astana, News at 10.
So did Mr Johnson do enough to save his skin? The former Prime Minister still has high-profile backers in his corner, but a prominent campaigner for families bereaved during the pandemic described his appearance as a new low. Our UK editor Paul, who has been at the forefront of breaking many of the key Partygate developments, has also heard from a former Downing Street staffer who says what Mr Johnson said today does not tally with what they saw.
What we were trying to do was follow the guidance. We were making a huge effort to follow the guidance. That does not mean that what we were doing, in my view, is incompatible with the guidance.
He kept saying today he'd stuck to the guidance, but were MPs, in fact, misguided by him. Some Boris Johnson worked with think so. This former member of staff in Number 10 watched all the evidence, but didn't recognise much of it.
From what you saw and heard in Number 10, was Boris Johnson telling the truth today, the whole truth?
It's really questionable, because what I saw compared to what he said he saw, they're two different things. He was going on about all the assurances that were given to him, but at the end of the day, why did he need the assurances when he was there himself? He could have shut the whole thing down himself. It just feels like he's trying to wriggle out of it again.
But those behind Boris Johnson, quite literally today, still believe he has no case to answer. A dozen or so MPs joined him in the room, others took to Twitter. Like Nadine Dorries, who said Boris Johnson was very clear today, not sure there is a reasonable person in the land who would think that the committee could do anything other than totally exonerate him, and not before time either. For Michael Fabricant, the interrogation of Boris Johnson is turning into a show trial, and Jacob Rees-Mogg hit out at a kangaroo court, tweeting Boris is doing very well against the marsupials.
I think Boris has won in the court of public opinion, and that's ultimately for politicians what matters.
Do you think he'd win a by-election?
Oh, yes, but I doubt a by-election will be necessary.
It could be the outcome if the committee finds against Boris Johnson, which others think is almost certain.
My take, for what it's worth, is that I think he demeaned the office of Prime Minister because he told people in the House of Commons things categorically which have now proved to be completely and utterly untrue.
And for others, the truth, as they see it, hurts, including for some of Boris Johnson's constituents in Uxbridge. These two brothers lost their dad, who died alone on a COVID ward almost exactly 3 years ago.
For the COVID bereaved families, it just feels like an insult all the time. And every time he's on telly and he's coming up with just trying to bluff his way out of everything what happened. If Boris Johnson came out for once and told the truth, it still wouldn't be easy, but the family, and I'm sure a lot more victims, will have a lot more respect for the person.
Many may have already made up their minds, but Boris Johnson still hopes to influence others sitting on this committee.
So, Paul, this is the final showdown in the scandal that effectively ended Boris Johnson's term in number 10. But the question is, could this see his entire political career come to an end and see him lose his seat as an MP?
Yeah, and Raggy, I think there's kind of two questions in that. Firstly, there's the question of whether the committee will find that he did indeed mislead MPs. On that front, it certainly felt as though they were leaning towards that conclusion today. Sitting in the room as I was, kind of watching them glance at one another and nod at one another, it felt as though they were really struggling with some of the evidence that Boris Johnson was providing. They were particularly incredulous when it came to things like his argument that work parties, these leaving parties in particular, were necessary for work purposes. This idea that although he'd gone to events, he hadn't been able to perceive any guidance being broken. And also this idea that he had to keep relying on his advisors to tell him that no guidance had been broken. But then there's the question leading on from that. If they do find that he misled MPs, what kind of sanction will they impose on him? And here's where I think it's far more uncertain, because it only will transpire that there's a by-election if they suspend him from Parliament for longer than 10 days. And there's a range of opinion across the political spectrum about whether they would go that far. Yes, he was a serving Prime Minister. Surely the standards must be applied to the strictest degree with him. But, is there a smoking gun here that makes it an absolute slam dunk that he was sort of flagrantly misleading MPs? That's less certain. So I think the sanction will be vital. But of course, if they do end up pushing him towards a by-election, then Partygate could cost him his career as both PM and MP.
OK. Paul, thank you very much. We know you'll be following it as closely as you have been thus far. Thank you. Well, today's massive media focus on Boris Johnson may well have drawn the sting out of another long-awaited and highly anticipated political event, the publication of Rishi Sunak's tax documents. Indeed, Labour's deputy leader Angela Rayner tweeted, "Wonder why he's chosen today." Well, his predecessor, Mr Johnson's 10th appearance in Parliament, might have had something to do with bearing potentially bad news.
The Prime Minister was visiting Wales tonight, but that wasn't far enough from Westminster to escape questions about his tax return.
Well, I published my tax returns because I said I would in the interest of transparency, and I'm glad to have done that. Now, I think ultimately what people are interested in is what I'm going to do for them. And, you talk about the cost of living. Of course, that's the number one priority that I've got.
Rishi Sunak had promised to publish his taxes during the leadership contest.
Thank you.
6 months later, they were slipped out on the day Boris Johnson's difficulties were taking most of the limelight.
It does make it look as if they're trying to sneak it out while everyone's attention is on Boris and the inquiry, when in actual fact it's his tax returns, and we will not judge Rishi Sunak on how wealthy he is and how much tax he pays, as long as he pays his tax. We will judge him on his actions, and it will be his tax hikes on ordinary families, pensioners in this country, which will be what people judge him on.
It's never been in doubt that the Prime Minister and his wife, herself the daughter of a billionaire, are extremely wealthy. The couple have a house in Yorkshire as well as London and California, and his expensive taste in clothes has been noticed. What the summary of his returns show is that the size of his salary, $156,000 in the last tax year when he was Chancellor, is dwarfed by the income he receives from his US-based investments of £1.8 million. And on that total, he paid just £432,000 in tax. Economists point out that's because the tax system favours the wealthy.
So what really stands out is that the vast majority of Mr. Sunak's income comes from capital gains, and capital gains are only taxed at about 20%. So overall, he's paying a much lower rate on his overall income than the vast majority of people in this country who get most of their income from earnings.
Rishi Sunak needed to be transparent on his tax after his wife was revealed to have non-dom status when he was Chancellor. But his great wealth does leave him open to the accusation. He's rather cushioned from the concerns of most of us. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, it was a good day for Mrs Sunak in another respect, as he comfortably saw off a revolt by Tory backbenchers over his post-Brexit trade plan for Northern Ireland.
The ayes to the right, 515. The noes to the left, 29.
Just 22 Conservative rebels, including Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, defied the party whip to vote against the deal agreed with Brussels by the Prime Minister, known as the Windsor Framework. The vote was hailed as a turning point by a government spokesman. Well, Robert is in his West London studio ahead of his programme following this bulletin. So, Robert, I guess a rather breathless day of political theatre at Westminster. What do you make of it all in the round?
So just to be clear, you said it was a very good day for Rishi Sunak in the sense that he got his reform to Northern Ireland's Brexit deal through the House of Commons. And you are right that only 22 Tory MPs voted against, but they did include two former Prime Ministers, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, and a former Tory leader in Ian Duncan Smith. Perhaps another 40 Tory MPs abstained. So this is still an issue that splits the Tory party, and the spectacle of that is not great for the reputation of the Tory party, and it's never great for a Prime Minister to get a really important piece of legislation through on the back of Labour and SNP support, which is what happened today. I find it quite difficult to judge whether the confirmation, well, we all knew this, that Rishi Sunak is a very wealthy person, probably in the top 0.1% of earners in the UK, whether that's sort of good or bad for him. On my show tonight, I asked Labour's leader in Scotland, Anna Sarwar. I mean, he sort of criticised Rishi Sunak for the fact that he's building a swimming pool, but he insisted he's not into the politics of envy. But I think the worst thing for Rishi Sunak today is basically just seeing all those allegations about rule-breaking in Downing Street on display again in 3.5 hours of interrogation of the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. I think for many British people, simply seeing an ex-Prime Minister saying that he thinks he did nothing wrong when, millions and millions of people were not allowed to have a drink with friends, I think, that is not something. We've had I asked the Tory chairman about this in my programme in just a minute or you can see this, but this is not something that most Tories relish as being good for their party.
Well, we'll look forward to that interview with the chairman and with other of your guests. Robert, thank you very much indeed. And you can hear more of Paul's analysis on the key moments from today's marathon grilling and where it leaves Boris Johnson in the latest episode of our podcast, What You Need to Know, presented by Mary Nightingale. Listen on our website, wherever you get your podcasts. Well, if all that wasn't enough, the government got some unexpected bad news on inflation today. News which means more hardship for millions of households, but which could also have a major knock-on effect on interest rates. Annual inflation moved from 10.1% in January to 10.4%. And food and non-alcoholic drinks were up 18.2%, the highest for 45 years. Restaurants and hotel costs also rose sharply to 12.1%, with clothing and footwear prices rising up 8% in 12 months. But as Joel explains, what's likely to happen down the road could well be as significant as the effects right now.
Food inflation is rampant and Sharon Honey's family is up against it as a result. She's a single mother and a full-time ambulance worker in Warrington. She's working overtime and nights to raise the money she needs to cover the bare essentials.
There's only me to cover my bills. I want to give my son everything that every other child has. So I'll make sacrifices so that he's okay.
The good news is the international market price of a host of commodities has fallen in recent months, including wheat, maize, barley, oil, gas and electricity. This wholesaler in Birmingham hasn't seen the pace of price rises slow yet, but they will.
Really, there's not a lot we can do about it. We're hoping as an industry that cost prices come down at some point, but it's unlikely that they will come down much from where we are today.
Although the headline rate of inflation rose to 10.4% last month, the Bank of England expects it to fall sharply in the months to come, reaching 3.9% by the end of the year, still well above the bank's target rate of 2%. What's concerning, though, is that core inflation, which excludes food and energy prices, also rose last month, suggesting price rises are widespread. Services inflation increased too, traditionally a sign of strong wage growth.
In the face of high inflation, the evidence suggests that companies may still be raising their prices to protect their profits, and that employees may be asking for and getting higher pay rises. Both of these things, in as much as they are true, run the risk that inflation starts to feed itself.
Investors are now betting on an interest rate rise tomorrow. Bank rate stands at 4%, but this former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee thinks it'll have to rise further if inflation is to be tamed.
Obviously, things are more uncertain because of the banking sector difficulties in the US. But if those settle down, then I think it's not implausible that the bank will ultimately have to take rates above 5%.
Tonight, in the United States, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 0.25%, despite the series of recent bank failures. Tomorrow, the Bank of England is expected to do the same here. Joel Hills, News at 10.
Now, we'd like, if we may, to pause for a little and remember one of the saddest and most shocking moments ever suffered by ITV News and the people who work for it. 20 years ago today, correspondent Terry Lloyd, translator Hussein Osman and camera operator Fred Nirak were in a vehicle hit by American fire on the road to Basra in southern Iraq. Terry and Hussein were killed. Fred is still officially classed as missing. We remember Terry, Hussein and Fred and pay tribute to the skill and bravery of the whole team on that fateful day. The Prince of Wales has made a surprise visit to British troops based just an hour's drive from the border with Ukraine in Poland. Prince William thanked the troops at an air defence base for defending, as he put it, our freedoms.
His arrival was flanked by black-shaded bodyguards, the very tightest security for the heir to the throne 50 miles from the Ukrainian border. This is a visit Prince William personally wanted to make to a crude camp on Polish soil to meet the British soldiers working to support their Ukrainian counterparts.
You're doing a really important job out here, and defending our freedoms is really important, and everyone back home thoroughly supports you, and everything you're doing with the Poles and our Polish counterparts in providing that safety is really important. So thank you for your time, lovely to meet you all, and good luck. Thank you.
At this secretive base, the Prince of Wales was shown an air defence system being manned by British troops in coalition with Poland and the US, part of what he called a shared determination to protect freedom. His visit appreciated by those stationed here.
I think it's hugely important that our people feel supported when they spend a significant amount of time away from their families, away from their loved ones. It's important to know and feel the unity of the countries behind them.
He also met volunteers from the Polish Territorial Defence Force, who've been instrumental in Poland's humanitarian response to the war across the border. Tomorrow he'll meet the Polish president as the prince, now first in line to the throne, takes on an ever more serious role. We're told Prince William wanted to come here to personally thank British and Polish troops, and also because what's happening across the border is one of the biggest political issues in the world right now. That's a sign of his evolving priorities in his new role as Prince of Wales. Tonight he visited an accommodation centre in Warsaw, offering meals, activities and language classes for Ukrainian women and children still seeking sanctuary here. a need that continues and which continues to be met by what he called the inspiring humanity of the Polish people. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Poland.
Water companies and their bosses came under strong criticism today in a major new report into sewage pollution. It said there has been a widespread failure to give water in Britain's rivers, estuaries and coasts the care and importance it deserves. The report called for those who run water companies involved in major pollution incidents to be barred from working in the sector.
In the bucolic Surrey countryside, something ugly is happening to our waterways, and the River Mole is no exception. Ken still swims here with Chico, but has had to move upstream.
I tend to swim deliberately above the sewage outlet.
Yeah.
You know, this is why I come here.
Yeah.
'Cause it's upriver from that.
And here is the sewage outlet. It's been pumping murky waste into this river for 400 hours so far this year. Does it matter?
It does matter. For the river environment, it causes algal blooms, it causes bacteria to multiply, and this deoxygenates the river, causing what we call eutrophication. And that can actually land up killing fish, causing a degradation in the whole ecosystem.
Water companies are allowed to release waste into rivers when heavy rain overwhelms the system, but it's now regularly happening. I think the figures tell their own story. Water companies pumped raw sewage into English waters more than 300,000 times in just 1 year. I mean, that all adds up to more than 2.5 million hours during which our waste was flowing through rivers, just like this one, and coastal waters. And that's in just 1 year. It's why today's report has called on water companies and their regulator to do more. Much of what it says is that you aren't doing enough to stop pollution in rivers, and you're lining the pockets of the bosses but not investing in infrastructure to ensure the rivers are clean.
So the water industry has invested about £190 billion since privatisation. Equally, I completely recognise that we've been too slow to react to the public outcry about storm overflows. But what I will say is that that is a #1 priority for the water industry now.
Amy fishes along here. She reports sewage spills but has no faith anything will change.
No one will come out, and if they do, it might be days later after the incident's happened, and then nothing's done. Nobody is held accountable.
And it's that, the report says, that needs to change. Emily Morgan, News at 10 in Surrey.
Well, finally, as you might expect, the hit Netflix series The Crown was once again among the nominations for the TV BAFTAs announced today. Established stars like Daniel Radcliffe and Gary Oldman also received their first ever nominations, while among the 19 nods for ITV is personal finance presenter Martin Lewis.
You go and find the anaesthetist.
It's the doctor that makes you go sleep.
It's stories of the front line that are the front runners at this year's TV BAFTAs. This Is Going to Hurt, the dramatic following of a junior doctor, has 6 nominations.
He doesn't have any food.
Look at the size of him.
As does The Responder, a series centred on a police officer in Liverpool. The writers of both shows retelling their own real-life experiences on the small screen.
I think the shows that really resonate with viewers and with critics at the moment are shows that actually tell a story about our society, maybe highlighting an issue that needs greater people, more people talking about it, might be sort of highlighting an injustice.
Well, I think you should just get dressed.
In the lead actress category, Kate Winslet picked up a nomination for I Am Ruth, while Imelda Staunton got one too for her work as the Queen on The Crown. Oh, yeah! Harry Potter star Daniel Radcliffe got his first ever BAFTA nomination for his portrayal of Weird Al Yankovic.
85% of homes are now on.
Martin Lewis, who won a National Television Award last year, scored a nomination for the Martin Lewis Money Show Live.
Someone throughout the show should find something that puts more money in their pocket. It's wonderful that television can acknowledge a format that, if we're really honest, in truth, would never have been commissioned as it is now. It is a PowerPoint presentation backed up by a Q&A. Who'd have thought that would work on television, let alone be nominated for a BAFTA?
Now, without that picture, there's no evidence, is there?
One of the surprise snubs was Coronation Street, which won Best Soap last year, but didn't even make the shortlist this time round.
Do you consent her?
Those who did get the nod for the TV awards have now got a nervous 7-week wait to find out if they've won. Rishi Dafta, News at 10.
And that's it for tonight. I'll see you tomorrow night. Thanks for watching. Good night.